Well, a really good evening to you, whether you're joining us here live at the Round Church. It's really good to see real people again here, or if you're joining us on the live stream online from wherever you're joining us, a warm welcome to the Round Church. A quick note on format, and then I will give a short introduction to Andrew, although that seems pretty redundant. He's well known around here. But Andrew's going to speak for about 45, 50 minutes on our topic for tonight, which is the God who is not like you. And then we're going to go into a time of Q&A, where there'll be a chance to interact with Andrew on the ideas he shared. And then if you're here in the building, you're very welcome not to rush off, but to stay and grab a glass of something and enjoy it with us towards the end. I hope that suits everyone. Hope that's what you're expecting from this evening. But it's a great delight to welcome Andrew Fellows tonight. He is the Director of Apologetics here at Christian Heritage. He is a Canadian-born Englishman. Thank you. And he's married to a delightful lady from Yorkshire, Helen, who normally would be with us, but who's visiting family at the moment. And Andrew, for many years, worked at L'Abri in Hampshire. For those of you who don't know, L'Abri is a study centre come residential. How would you describe it, Andrew? Community in Hampshire for those who are asking serious questions about life, about the meaning of life, about God. And for many years, Andrew headed up L'Abri, both in Gresham, Hampshire, and across the world. And since 2016, we've been blessed to have him with us at Christian Heritage. If you know Andrew, you know he always brings a fresh perspective to questions old and new. And we're looking forward to hearing him tonight as he talks to us about the doctrine of God for a self-obsessed age. Andrew,
thank you, Josh. Thank you. Good. Lovely to see you. Lovely to be out of the machine. The ghost has been set free. Sorry for those who are live streaming this. You're still ghosts in the machine, but it is nice to be a ghost out of the machine and be in a real space with real live people. That's special. Good. Okay, so this is a three-part series, The Doctrine of God for a Self-Obsessed Age. And each of the three talks is going to follow a similar pattern. We're going to break them all down into three sections. Firstly, we're going to begin by looking at a particular aspect of what's known as the doctrine of God. Then we're going to look at how the secular age has set up something that resists this truth. It's really in opposition to it. Then we're going to finish by highlighting why a return to the truth about who God is so essential for our age. So those are the three sections we're going to work through. Okay, so let's start with the first particular aspect of the doctrine of God. When you look at who God is, I would say the first thing that becomes clear, if you've got the Bible in your hand and some good theology, the first thing that becomes clear is that God is not like us. God is essentially different to human beings. He has the kind of nature or the kind of being that's totally other. And this truth is actually reflected in the first verse of Scripture, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God. So God is already there when time and space comes into being. When creation occurred, God is there. God exists. So the God revealed in Scripture, in the Bible, is uncreated being. And that then sets up a distinction with everything else that exists, which is created being. So that makes for what we might call the biblical chronology. Uncreated, created. And my favorite Dutch philosopher with an unpronounceable name, Herman Dooyeweerd, he calls this distinction, the distinction between these two, the absolute boundary of being. So, at the foundation of the doctrine of God is what I call a two-ism, the creator and the created. And this is essential to the doctrine of God. Now, this two-ism is reflected in lots of places as you begin to look at who God is. You see it firstly in the study of what's known as God's attributes, the divine attributes. Theologians usually begin their study with God with something called the incommunicable attributes. So there are aspects of God's own being that are simply not transferable to humans because of this difference. So the incommunicable attributes emphasize the difference between God and the rest of creation. They completely set him apart. And we lack, therefore, the capacity to be like God because of this two-ism. Let me briefly list a few. Those of you who went to a good Sunday school, you've heard all this before, but we don't hear much about it today. God's infinity. That's one of his incommunicable attributes. God is a being without limitation. He has qualities in himself that are without measure. Endless love, the Bible says. Humans, by way of contrast, are finite creatures. He is infinite, we are finite. So to be human is fundamentally to exist with limits, which is why Edith Schaeffer said it's not a sin to be limited. It's a sin to think you're unlimited, because humans are limited beings. It's fundamental to what we are. There's the two-ism. Another incommunicable attribute would be his eternity. Here's a being who has no beginning. He doesn't have a birthday. There's no moment when his existence began. He also has no end. Now, he has a beginning, and we also have an end. And one day our graves will be marked. Andrew Fellows, born June 3rd. I'm not going to give you the year, but I have a year. And then died, whenever that's going to be. God's eternity, we don't have that. We have a beginning and an end. Then you could look at God's immutability, which is to say that God doesn't change. He's the perfect, the absolute one. So it's not possible for God to improve, to get better, or to diminish and become worse. He is what he is. But humans, by way of contrast, we're constantly changing. So when it comes to creation, the pre-Socratics got it right, or one of them, he said, what is changing. We change. That's what it means to be human. And then another of the incommunicable attributes would be God's omnipresence. Here's one who's unlimited in such a way that space cannot contain him. So God fills every point of this universe with the fullness of his being. One of the early fathers put it so well. God is the one whose circumference is nowhere, he's infinite, but whose center is everywhere. It's beautiful, isn't it? Circumference is nowhere, whose center is everywhere. We as humans by way of contrast, are limited to space. We can only occupy one space at any given moment. So you do the contrast, you study God's attributes, and you see this two-ism at the very foundation of who God is. And I would say the two-ism also reflects itself in the fact that God is beyond human comprehension. And many, and I agree with them, would say this is the starting point for actually knowing who God is in his being. God is the incomprehensible one. So to wrestle with the divine nature is to grapple with the ungraspable. His being is beyond comprehension. And that's why the knowledge of God begins in a paradox, so says Herman Bavinck. In order to express God, you express him firstly as the great inexpressible. That's where you begin. That is true to who God is. He's not like us. So here's where two-ism is expressed. And of course, God's first revealed name in Scripture was to Moses in Exodus. And his name is Yahweh. And for the Jews, this symbolized God as the unnameable. They didn't even take that name on their lips. He was the unnameable one. That was the way they expressed him. So that's the biblical cosmology, a two-ism. We could say so much more, but that's an intro to it. Now let's look at the secular cosmology of one-ism. The secular cosmology poses a structure of reality that is in opposition to the two-ism at the root of who God is. So here's a cosmology, a view of the real that works as a monism. The world, the cosmos, is everything, and there's nothing outside. There's nothing beyond. So you see this with the modern materialistic outlook, sometimes referred to as naturalism. So here's reality, which is a monism that roots everything in atoms. There's nothing beyond the atomic. The atomic is the basis of all things. Now that's in opposition to the biblical cosmology, which is a two-ism. But the secular cosmology is a one-ism. Now this is interesting. What's often overlooked with this new secular cosmology is that it's actually not new. One-ism was actually the structure of all the ancient cosmologies. It is not new. Now, a book I read recently which blew my mind is by Stephen Smith, an American scholar, called Pagans and Christians in the City. It's quite remarkable. Here's what Smith says. To describe the ancient cosmology against the biblical one, pagan religion locates the sacred within this world. In that way, paganism can consecrate the world from within. It is religiosity relative to an immanent sacred, i.e. a one-ism. Judaism and Christianity, by contrast, reflect transcendent religiosity. They place the sacred ultimately outside the world, i.e. a two-ism. So when you boil it down to the essentials, there are only two worldviews and two cosmologies. Sometimes we make it very complex, but actually there's only two. One-ism and two-ism. And that means history, all of history, is the outworking of a struggle between these two cosmologies. And Stephen Smith, it's one of the main arguments in his book, he says this is the better way to see the storyline of Western history. Most of us view it as a series of stages. History cycles through the stages. Europe was first pagan, one-ism, best epitomized in the Roman Empire. Then along came Constantine and Christianity takes over. That's the next stage, to two-ism. And then that gave way to the secular age, which moved beyond all of this with its Enlightenment thinking. And now we're moving into some kind of post-secular age. We cycle through stages that are progressive. And he says the better way to see Western history is an ongoing contest between these two cosmologies that I'm calling one-ism and two-ism. So that means that when the secular age opted for actually a form of paganism. And that's why we should see the secular age as a return to this cosmology. Because, as Stephen Smith writes, the choice between a Christian and a pagan society has always remained very much a live possibility. So, follow me so far? If secular cosmology is a form of one-ism, what does this look like? Now, it's interesting. One of the characteristics of one-ism through the ages is how many different forms it can assume. So anthropologists can give their whole life, their whole academic life, to understanding one strain of ancient paganism. They go to the place where they were and they explore their gods, their statues. They try to pick up the old mythologies, the religious rites and habits that went with it. But all of them, the various diverse one-isms, manifest the same structure of one-ism. It's the same in that sense. Now, it's exactly the same in the secular age. So as I mentioned a moment ago, one-ism shows itself today most obviously in naturalism. And naturalism is the first non-religious form of one-ism. And here it differs from ancient pagan cosmologies. With this science-led understanding, we come to what Max Weber calls the disenchantment of the worlds. The first true disenchantment. Substantial one. But still, naturalism is an understanding of the real that's relative to the immanent. It's an understanding of what the world is from within. Matter is everything. Now, because there's no God who transcends the worlds, the material worlds, we as humans are constrained by our biology. So biology, atoms, and cells, we have to be quite honest, don't give a crap about our well-being. Your cells don't care about you. That means we exist under a cold and harsh dictatorship caring nothing for us. And chaos, Jordan Peterson chaos, is encoded in every strand of our DNA, wearing us down through the aging process and also subject to sudden cataclysms of disaster, like when cancer strikes. It's a harsh mistress, but with no personality. She doesn't care. And then, of course, one-ism in the form of materialism doesn't allow for meaning, or what I like to call super meanings, the bigger meanings that help us grasp what life is for. And that's why in the aftermath of World War II, the Princeton philosopher Walter Stace expressed doubt that in the new understanding, the new one-ism, we could live with the implications of materialism. His question was, how can we possibly exist in such an empty, intrinsically meaningless world? He believed this was what it was, but how do we exist in it? Now, the answer to Stace's question is being answered today in the resurgence of an older form of one-ism. So in the 21st century, right now as we live, the old pagan cosmology is striking back. So we are seeing neo-paganism. This is the old form of one-ism in new dress. So Stephen Smith says, rather than disappearing, immanent religiosity, or paganism, as we have called it, has, like Proteus, merely altered its forms and manifestations. So just as the ancient paganism took lots of different forms, all fitting comfortably under the broad canopy of one-ism, modern paganism also takes lots of different forms. Now, if you want to see what this looks like, I highly recommend a recent publication written by a scholar called Tara Burton in America, and the title is Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. This is a remarkable book. Not every book I read I say is remarkable, but Stephen Smith's was remarkable, as is this. You're right. So, Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. Now Burton has helpfully researched the explosion of new religions. And it's going on all around us. Now, we can miss out on this because more and more people are identifying themselves as nuns. You know when you fill in a form and it says, what is your religious affiliation? Catholic, Muslim, Anglican, nonconformist, none. Now, more than 50% of people in America, she says, ticks the none box. So you think, oh, religion's dying. Well, Burton says, our nuns may not be traditionally religious in the sense that either Jerry Falwell or Sam Harris is used to, but they're not exactly secular either. A really important point. Now, these new religions that are popping up everywhere today are in opposition to all the old forms of religion, and especially to Christianity, as a reaction against two-ism, rooted in who the God of the Bible is. But we mustn't be fooled. There is an immense amount of religious activity going on in our world today. Now, she calls the form of these new religions remix, or hybrids, religious hybrids. Here's how she describes the remix religion. She says they aren't rejecting religion, rather they're remixing it. It's a story of how more and more Americans and Europeans, I would add, and particularly how more and more millennials envision themselves as creators of their own bespoke religions, mixing and matching spiritual and aesthetic and experiential and philosophical traditions. The remixed hunger for the same things human beings have always hungered for: a sense of meaning in the world and personal purpose within that meaning, a community to share the experience with, and rituals to bring the power of that experience into achievable everyday life. but they're doing it differently. And she goes on, this is a new, eclectic, chaotic, and thoroughly quintessentially American religion. It's also European. It's a religion of emotive intuition, of aestheticized and commodified experience, of self-creation and self-improvement, and yes, selfies. A religion for a new generation of Americans raised to think of themselves as both capitalist consumers and content creators. A religion decoupled from institution, from creeds, from metaphysical truth claims about God or the universe or the way things are, but that still seeks in various and varying ways to provide us with the pillars of what religion always has: meaning, purpose, community, and ritual. And she goes through those four things through her book to show the different ways different religions are doing this. Now, Burton doesn't make this point, but all these new forms of religion spreading through the West are onist in structure. They're the return of the old religious cosmology. Many of them are about interconnectedness. It's amazing how many talk about energies. You hear that? Even food energies now. The energy that runs through everything and connects everything. The energy says that you tap into in a yoga class, or the energy you get from drinking a moon juice concoction. People are becoming millionaires through selling this kind of stuff. And the energy you get from positive thinking. They're at once unifying spiritual constructs. The world is an inherently meaningful place with energy running through it. Now, this rise of the new religions is happening incredibly quickly today. I'm just trying to get my head around it. You think naturalism, materialism, but that's just one form of one-ism. This other wave is coming very, very quickly, like a tidal wave. Burton writes, at least half of America, she thinks, she's a researcher, and likely far more, is either a faithful nun, but not secular, or an SBNR, spiritual but not religious, or a religiously flexible hybrid. And she goes on, this outnumbers white evangelicals, a group traditionally considered among the most influential voting blocs in America, but whose numbers now are dwindling to just 15% of the population. So this new one-ism is serious stuff, and it's dominating today. And it shares the characteristics of this old religious cosmology that once existed in pre-Christian Europe. So, forms of this secular cosmology, one-ism, well, naturalism obviously fits into that very well. And then this new rise of religions, and we're going to look at those a little bit more in what they look like in the coming weeks. That's another form. Another one I want to mention, just before I move on, I think it needs highlighting. I call it selfism or egoism, and the title I've dubbed it with in my work over the last years is ego-paganism. The self at the center of everything. So the self in the modern context has filled the horizon to a degree there's no longer space for anything else. The self is all. And we consecrate the self, who we are from within, rather than relating to something or to someone that transcends us in the universe. Now, the 20th century prophetess of egoism was a woman by the name of Ayn Rand. Who's heard of Ayn Rand? Some of you have heard of her. She's not terribly well known. She's a Russian-American philosopher and novelist, 60s and big in the 70s. You don't hear much about her today, but Silicon Valley runs by the Ayn Rand playbook. She's a guru. Symbols of her stuff are everywhere, if you have eyes for them. Adam Curtis is a British documentary maker. He's done a good intro to her in his recent documentary with a wonderful title, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. And it starts with it's a great title, isn't it? All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. And it starts with an intro to Ayn Rand. Now, I've read quite a bit of her stuff. I read her at university. Her starting point is there's nothing outside the universe. And she says, you are the world. So only the self matters. There's nothing else for you to rely on. You are the world. And she advocated and wrote a book with this title, what she called the virtue of selfishness. She promotes it. People were horrified when she first read it, but more and more took it on board. She says there's one path for us to follow, which is your rational self-interest. And for Rand, this is what it meant to be heroic, to follow ruthlessly your rational self-interest. Now, this is another expression of one-ism, and I think it's dominant today, and dominant among the other forms that I've talked about. So, the doctrine of God, you begin with that, and you come up immediately with a two-ism, the uncreated and the created, and then you look at the secular cosmology, and you see, there's a one-ism here. And it's not brand new, it has reminiscences of what's been around for a very long time, and it exists in these various forms that I've laid out. Excuse me. Okay, let's move on. What do we have? We'll cover this in 10 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion. Now, this is my third section. I want to show why the recovery of two-ism has become critical for our times. We have to get this back. And basically, I'm arguing that one-ism has always been and is now a disaster for humans. It is not good for our lives. And the reason for that, you could argue it from different angles, is that humans require what I call a radical alterity. Alterity is the reality of otherness. We can only function in otherness. One of the reasons I love the French, what's called the French phenomenological stream in philosophy, starting at the beginning of the 20th century, well and alive today. The reason I love this is that the phenomenologists from the French tradition stress the importance of alterity. Humans need other. We can only function when other is there. And Christianity has this radical alterity because it says there's a two-ism, which is fundamentally at the structure of reality. Creator, creation. And I would say a true alterity requires this two-ism, the God who is not like us. And if we don't have this radical alterity, we're going to get lost in the cosmos. Now, why do I say this? Well, my first reason. It's only two-ism that allows for real distinction and diversity. So if you look back at the Genesis account, the creation account, there you see a creation where distinction is critical and central to how things are. The word separate is used 5 times in the creation account. So God separated the light from the darkness. He made a distinction. And God made humans in his image separate from the rest of nature. He set them apart. And he made the woman separate from the man with a real biological distinction. Now, these separations, these distinctions in creation were only possible because the God who made the worlds was himself distinct from creation. So it's all grounded in the reality of two-ism. Now, when this God, who transcends the universe, is removed from the picture, everything collapses into oneness. So you could argue, and I'm not going to go in much detail here, but one-ism in its various forms always moves towards a pantheism or a panentheism. Everything is one. Everything becomes absorbed into the same. So it's about unity, homogeneity at the expense of diversity. Colin Gunton, the late British theologian, wrote this book called The One, the Three, and the Many. And this is what he argues. The trajectory is always in that direction. So you see this with the form of naturalism. Naturalism is a form of one-ism. Humans within this cosmology are absorbed into nature, completely absorbed. There's nothing about our humanness that transcends the material natural realm. All of our faculties, our consciousness, our sense of being a self, not included in the world, that's just fiction. That's just brain circuits doing their thing. We are nature. We're one with nature. And then today, of course, we're seeing the abolition of distinction when it comes to gender. And this is another outcome, I believe, of a onist cosmology. Gender today is very quickly becoming non-binary. Binary means having two parts, which in the case of gender is male and female. That's binary. Non-binary is used to describe genders that don't fall into these categories of male and female. And as the LGBT website puts it, some people have a gender that blends elements of a man or a woman, or a gender that's different than either male or female, and some people don't identify with any gender, and some people's gender changes over time. So this is moving beyond the separation, the distinction of how God made things, to this blurring. Well, I wouldn't put it that way, but it's very, very strong in terms of how people see it. And I think it demonstrates the point that one-ism generally moves to an abolition of distinction. That's its trajectory. Now, when you look carefully at what's going on in our culture today, I think you can see some very troubling signs of this onist cosmology, where our humanness is being absorbed into the oneness. Now, I just want to highlight very briefly one modern phenomena that illustrates our being absorbed into oneness. And I want to talk briefly about the world of cybernetics and the great singularity. Norbert Wiener is known as the father of cybernetics. And Wiener's an interesting guy because he looks at nature and he looks at machines and he says, they work exactly the same. Everything for him was part of the human-machine system. And he thought the key to stabilizing society was to study the human-machine system to see how it worked in order to create order for the worlds. That's cybernetics, as it started. Now, after Wiener come what you might call the internet utopians. They, too, are very much interested in the human-machine synthesis. Some of them talk about a planetary consciousness that comes out of this, one that even transcends the state, nation states, to create a better order. We've got to focus there. So they believe that this synthesis between humans and machines would create a better world. But it's all premised on us being one with the machine. And then much more recently, the techno-humanists are talking a lot about what they call the great singularity. This is the merging of man and machine. The mechanical, including the digital, are integrated. Transhumanism. So every step of the techno-humanists as they go through it is towards this absorption of humans to the machine. Now, I would say to a very significant degree, this has already occurred. Those of you who know me say, here you go, fellows. I knew you were going to take another pot shot at the internet. But I think it's happening. We live a huge amount of our life, our existence, within the World Wide Web. What a name. Wow. WWW. Now, this has become one of the later iterations of one-ism. This digital sphere that's accountable to nothing beyond itself. It's relative to itself. And I believe it's absorbing us into its own digital consciousness. It doesn't really have a consciousness, but it conditions our thinking, our mental life, our desires, our imaginaries, our moral outlook, our political outlook. Incredibly powerful. So I don't think you have to look today much further than cybernetics, what they call the Internet of Everything, to see a form of one-ism at work. And it's working with what I believe are catastrophic consequences to our humanity. It's a road. That's the problem with one-ism. It moves in the direction of abolishing distinction. And in the end, the oneness absorbs us. And that's why we need a recovery of two-ism, which is at the foundation of the doctrine of God. His being enshrines radical alterity. Distinctions matter. The individual matters, and here's why. It allows for separation and distinction. Okay, second reason why we have to recover two-ism today. Two-ism is essential for the satisfaction of our infinite longings. Now, we've already seen earlier that human nature is different to God's nature because we're limited. The one exception to the limitation in us, you could argue perhaps, is our human longing and desire. What's at the very core of us? At least from our perspective, our human longings are unfathomable, which is why Augustine called our internal world with its desire an abyss. Wow, an abyss. It's so big. The desire it's so strong, it reaches so deep. So unlike anything else in creation, humans have this depth of desire and longing that nothing in this world can satisfy. I said this to a little group yesterday. You can think about it like this. If you manage to achieve every goal you have in life, you've got the perfect house where nothing breaks down. I just love that. Every other day something breaks down. But no, you've got the perfect house. Everything works fine. And you every way, it satisfies you. It gets the best out of you. If you had all those things, I believe the Bible is true when it says you'd still be left with a hunger that's unsatisfied. And C.S. Lewis called this the inconsolable longing. A longing that goes so deep that nothing in this world can relieve it, can give satisfaction to it. And that's why Lewis went on to say about the inconsolable desire and longing, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. Now, this other world Lewis is talking about is a two-ism, the God who's really there, the God who transcends us and the universe, but is there for us. Infinite and personal. We were made for him, for one who is infinitely good, infinitely loving, and so many people, Christians, lose this point. He's infinitely happy. Infinitely happy. And knowing him is something that he has made possible. And when we do begin to come to some kind of knowledge of him, that begins to touch the inconsolable longing, because we have desires that were made for another world. Now, one-ism is a cosmology, that arrangement. Naturalism says it's just atoms. And Walter stages that. But at the end of the day, it's still in the framework of one-ism. It lacks this transcendent point. And in the next couple of lectures, we're going to see that it doesn't go far enough. We'll see its weaknesses. So, two-ism is necessary because of the inconsolable longing. We were made for this God. And then thirdly and finally, two-ism provides the only basis for the rescue we require. It's the only basis for the rescue we require. I don't know anyone who would deny today that some kind of rescue for this planet is necessary. Look at the modern environmental movement. It's driven by this urgent sense. Rescue is necessary. Our planet needs saving, and we have to save it fast. And in a few weeks, it's going to happen. Well, hopefully some steps towards it. They seem very optimistic. But anyway, that's good. Measures must be taken. But it's not just our planet that needs saving. We need saving. There's something wrong with humans, something bent out of shape. So this world order that cybernetics promised us, it hasn't come to fruition. Humans seem just as capable as ever of cruelty and hatred and chaos. Now, one-ism is a cosmology that creates a story of how we rescue ourselves from within. And who's going to save us within a oneness framework? Well, nature ain't going to save us. Despite what the neo-pagans say about nature, harmonizing with the energies that stabilize us, nature is blindly indifferent to us. You ever thought about this? If the human race went extinct, nature wouldn't give a damn. It wouldn't even know we'd left the planet, because it has no awareness. Nature has no consciousness. It wouldn't know we're no longer there. I think that argument, I think there's something to it. And then you look at secular humanism. In the early phase, committed to the common good, creating what Kant called the categorical imperative. If we all follow that, we'll create a much more stable society. It hasn't worked. It's falling apart. Last 100 years, we have tried so many political ideologies to rescue ourselves. We've tried socialism into communism. We've tried nationalism. We've tried conservatism. And now some are living in the hope that the new liberalism will pull it off and rescue us. The trouble with the new liberalism is that it's not about building anything. It's just about dismantling something, tearing it down. And that's why everything is spiraling into more and more chaos and outrage and grievance. So I think many are cosmology. There's another rescue story, a true story. It's about a rescue that comes from the kind of freedom that can mount a real rescue. And he has done that, says the Bible, by sending his eternal Son, sending him from the outside into our space. So the Son of God became fully human and lived inside the cosmos. But he came from outside. But he's made as one fully human, inhabiting our humanity, going through the full range of human experience. And the remarkable thing about Jesus Christ is that he bridges the two-ism of the Bible's cosmology. He is God, the God who is not like us, and he's also fully us. He's fully human. And he came in this arrangement to pull off the greatest rescue in human history. Now, that is what's required for the true rescue. We need this two-ism, because if we're left inside one-ism to try and pull off the rescue ourselves, we're just going to exhaust ourselves with the rescue attempts. And it's interesting, Tara Burton ends her book with all the cynicism that's in our world. She says, we're in the place where the only thing we can do is laugh in the face of the emptiness and watch the world allows for. The God who's not like us, who could enter the chaos in Jesus. So two-ism provides the only basis for the rescue we require. Okay, that's enough from me. See, 3 sections in your head, and the various points made. Thank you. Good. Well, let's open it up to questions, conversation. You're my guinea pigs, those of you who are not ghosts in the machine. Wait, you are too, but I'm trialing this material and want to work it in various ways. So help me. Ian.
Andrew, I would say that the ancient paganism, which sacralized nature, and the modern paganism, which sacralizes the self, and the modern materialism, which sacralizes nothing, are they all sufficiently alike as rejecting the other, rejecting any sense of transcendence? Is that what is most common about them?
Yeah.
Because there are differences.
Yeah. So Ian's articulated it very well. Ancient cosmology sacralized nature. Modern religious cosmologies, oneness cosmology, sacralize the self. But materialism, naturalism, doesn't sacralize anything. It's the disenchantment of the world. So they're quite different. And that's why I say paganism has always been capable of many different forms, of many different dresses. But what holds them together is that there's nothing outside. It's immanent and consecrated, if I can use the word, from within. There's nothing outside that gives meaning to it.
Human beings are self-created beings, in a sense, all products of nature.
Yeah. So, yeah.
I think that nature is still always there as a physical platform for us to experience our ethereal spiritual bodies to do with our connection with the Almighty.
Yep.
Nature was always there, and as the point that you made about paradoxes, paradox is one of the most relevant words in the whole to describe anything in the state of play where we are, because we're saying that physical entity, nature itself, evolved itself outside of the created. It's evolved,
What's interesting?
moved away from
Yeah.
what was created, and it's evolved in its own way.
So what's interesting?
Cruelty actually does exist.
Right. Cruelty is in nature, red in tooth and claw. What's interesting about nature within the biblical framework, calls it creation, is that it has signposts. Nature itself is a signpost, a reflector of this transcendent reality.
I still think it's provided a lot of wisdom over the eons and the years. It's still provided a lot of wisdom. But this is the whole point about why can't the one-ism, why can't they realise that really, no matter how far they try and blur the real reality, they will not succeed in blurring the real reality.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
No one truly succeeds.
I mean, in a sense that's where.
We should just forgive each other more and be more understanding. This is the word.
Yeah. I think the Bible would say to that naturally we're in a state of blindness. We can't see what's obvious. So we need enlightenment, a special enlightenment is what the work of salvation is about. But thank you. Other
within the governments, but also universities and civil service, that there is much attention for diversity. You see that in the employment of diversity officers and so on. And I think that, if I'm correct, it lies in the sort of postmodern thinking that there's like this criticism on enlightenment or modern thinking, where there are these ideas of essentialism and universalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was thinking, but if these ideas about diversity and first of all, my question is this attention for diversity, is that grounded in sort of like Christian Judeo-heritage, what is still sort of present in our modern society, and now maybe it evolves to a post-secular age where it might be grounded in one-ism, then this sort of, what you said, then it will collapse all in together. So we want to, like, the current sort of vision is to strive for diversity, but if it's grounded in one-ism, then it will collapse. So
Absolutely.
So this is something I'm grappling with for a long time, but I was wondering, this is a kind of my thoughts. Could you maybe reflect on this a bit or spell it a bit out?
Is it Naomi? Naomi, you've articulated it extremely well, because you're right. Diversity training, I mean, it's at the core of all of our civic practices. Now you have to go through diversity training. But actually, I think because it is grounded in a onist cosmology, it is collapsing right now. So you look at intersectionality and how that's possible. No one can function in the real world with the intersectionality quotas that are put on us. So it's collapsing, and I think this is where we're going to see a Jordan Petersonian chaos really come into play, because then power is going to become the main thing. So I think what you see at the moment is there's no way to hold unity and diversity together. So that they're splitting apart. So we're seeing this incredible attention to diversity, but it's not going to work. But anyone else got any thoughts on this?
Just encouragement to keep questions quite short and to the point, for the benefit of our live stream.
Sorry, no problem. That was an excellent question.
Join us as well.
Can I just comment on the diversity? I think the sort of modern diversity that you're talking about actually isn't really diversity. It is very often just dealing with groups of various kinds.
We're trying to
recognise individuals, and so there isn't a real recognition of the true diversity between us.
Because we're so often in this modern world trying to appease something superficially, and we're not having the holistic
going deeper.
The context of the diversity which we're being sold, and the diversity of which has been destroyed. The context has been eroded.
Because diversity is highly important, but not a superficial one, which I think is your point, Ian. Thank you.
Because, for example, we have various groups that aren't secular that have been persecuted, and we are being sold a diversity that's kind of very sickening.
Doug,
Thank you very much for a very helpful talk. When you said that two-ism allows for real distinction and diversity, I think you rooted that in the basic distinction between God and everything else, God and creation. Could you, and you might have been touching on this when you referenced Colin Gunton, I think.
Yeah.
Could you root it back in God himself?
Indeed.
Who is one, but also
The one and the many.
distinction.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The triune
Yeah.
God.
There's the Trinity, the three.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
No, absolutely. In a sense, I started with the doctrine of God in the classic sense, which I think came late to the Trinity, which is a terrible mistake, and I made the same mistake. But yes, once you look at the nature of the uncreated and the created, I like starting then, who is this God? Well, within the Godhead is this remarkable unity and diversity. In diversity, yep.
Unfathomable in a sense.
Yeah.
As you so eloquently put, we have this amazing connection, which is eternal.
Good. Yep. Thank you. Never bypass the Trinity. That's the deepest revelation of who this God is. That's when we see him for who he is. Yep. Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. As it relates to the doctrine of God, and you open the talk with the distinction between the creator and the creation,
Yep.
I wonder if that's a more of a cosmological distinction rather than within the doctrine of God. Because
Yeah.
a friend of Aristotle, Ellis, would say, the Trinitarian framework of Christianity is what makes that unique rather than the dualism, which I guess could be confused with the two-ism thing.
Yeah.
Can you just repeat the question?
Okay, good question by Jack. So the cosmology, you start there, you end in a kind of dualism. But you see, I'm not afraid of the right dualism. I think today it's become sort of a swear word. Any form of dualism is seen as wrong. And I think we often then, you're not, but default to a kind of monism very, very quickly. But I think there are dualisms all over the place, legitimate dualisms, and that's one. I think, yeah, I should have done more in the Trinity. You both have made this point very, very helpfully. So thank you. Yeah.
It's more just a language, because you
Yeah.
talk about the infinite and the personal, which is a doctrine of God thing, which is
Yeah.
a bit of a dualism.
Yep, and that begins to bridge these two. I think today many Christians find two-ism astonishing. It's surprising to them. They've never confronted it, but it was basic to the early church understanding, and the reformers for Calvin. It was just utter central. And I've walked with Christians and just talked about these two cosmologies, and many Christians said, "Wow, I'd never thought of it like that before." But I think it's basic. So I think it's 101. We have to go back to it.
Are you ready to go in a different direction, Andrew? Doomed.
Okay, so I did mention at the end. I did mention at the end that this planet needs a rescue. So, and I'm not a denier. I think there is something going on which is cause for alarm. I think the way we treat climate change and the environmental disaster which is unfolding comes right out of one-ism. So we often personalize our terms as we talk about what's going on here. We almost sacralize. I think it's one of the points where materialism begins to get consecrated from inside, just the way we talk about it. Movement is within a very secular cosmology. And as Christians, I think we have to find a way of engaging it and actually explaining it in terms that are different. Because too much Christian environmentalism, to me, sounds like the Times or the Guardian with a bit of God on top. And you think, I think we have to have something far more rigorous and integral to our cosmology as we think this through. I also don't have, I have to be careful here because it raises such heat and fire. But I struggle with people who are Christians who are the deniers of all this or who couldn't care less. I think that also is a highly irresponsible way to treat God's good creation, his good gift to us. We are stewards and we have to take it very seriously. But it's quite hard as we sift through all the media sound bites about what's going on. I like reading environmentalists who aren't Christians, who themselves are becoming rather skeptical about just the way the whole thing's being. Good. Should we leave it there? Thank you for your good listening and your questions. Any other thoughts that come? Fire it my way. Good, thank you.
Can the people online hear the questions? I'm a little bit concerned.
I think I'm meant to repeat them a little bit better than I did, yeah.
Or the discussion.
Josh.
Wonderful. Should we give Andrew a hand?
Thank you.
Thank you once again for those who have joined us in person tonight and for those who've joined through the live stream. It's been wonderful to have you with us. The live stream is about to end, but just a reminder, I don't know if you can see me on the live stream. I'm going to just... but next week, we will be back at the same time. The Doctrine of God for a Self-Obsessed Age. An age which doesn't think it needs a doctrine of God.
No.
And yet... That's the promise of this series, that we're thinking through theology for an age which doesn't recognize the need for theology. Next week, it's the God who is true to himself. So I hope you'll join us again for a stimulating evening with Andrew. Until then, please do feel free, if you're here, to not rush off. There's a bit more wine left and some nibbles. And if you're now departing on the live stream, bid you farewell and hope to see you next week. A good evening to you all.